I gave your wedding money to Vanessa, my father said, cutting into his pot roast like he'd just mentioned the weather forecast. I sat across from him at my parents' dining room table, my fiancé Michael's hand warm against mine, and for a moment I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. The crystal chandelier my mother loved so much cast soft light over the table set with her good china, the same dishes she'd used for every Sunday dinner since I was a child, and everything looked so normal that the words couldn't possibly mean what I thought they meant. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed, my voice sounding distant and strange even to my own ears. My father looked up then, his expression mildly annoyed at having to repeat himself, and said, "The money we'd set aside for your wedding. Vanessa needs it more right now. She's starting a business, Emma. A real opportunity, you understand?" Beside me, Michael went very still in that particular way he had when he was paying close attention, his software engineer's mind processing and cataloging information. I felt the pressure of his fingers against mine increase slightly, a silent acknowledgement that he'd heard it too, that I wasn't imagining this. My sister Vanessa sat at the other end of the table, scrolling through her phone, not even pretending to be interested in the conversation that was dismantling my future. She was 25, 3 years younger than me, and she'd perfected the art of being elsewhere, even when she was physically present. "That money," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, "was mine. I saved $32,000 over 3 years. You promised to match it for the wedding." My mother made a small sound, something between a cough and a sigh, and reached for her wine glass. She'd perfected a different art over the years, the art of strategic silence, of being present but not really there when things got difficult. "Well, yes," my father said, returning to his pot roast with the matter apparently settled in his mind. "But it was in the joint account we set up together. Technically, it was family money. And family helps family, Emma. Vanessa has a real chance here. You and Michael are both working, you're stable, you can wait a bit longer or do something simpler." Something simpler. The words landed like stones in my chest. I'd been planning this wedding for 8 months, since the night Michael proposed at the botanical gardens where we'd had our first date. I'd chosen the venue, paid the deposit from my savings, selected flowers, tasted cakes, addressed invitations. The wedding was in 10 weeks. "How much did you give her?" Michael asked quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but I knew him well enough to hear the edge underneath. "All of it," my father said. 64,000. Like I said, Vanessa needs it now." And just like that, everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed and saved and planned, was gone. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of rain starting against Michael's windshield, a soft percussion that should have been soothing, but instead felt like it was tapping out the rhythm of my racing thoughts. I kept my face turned toward the window, watching the streetlights blur past, because if I looked at Michael, I was afraid I'd either start crying or screaming, and I wasn't sure which would be worse. 3 years. I'd saved that money for 3 years, transferring $200 from every paycheck into the joint account my father had suggested we open together, the account that was supposed to be for my future, for my wedding, for the one day in my life that was supposed to be about me. I remembered the conversation when he'd proposed the arrangement, how he'd sat across from me at the same dining room table where he'd just destroyed everything and said, "Emma, your mother and I want to help with your wedding when the time comes. Let's open an account together. You save what you can, and we'll match it when you're ready." I'd been so grateful, so touched, that finally, they were investing in me the way they'd always invested in Vanessa. Every month for 36 months I'd made that transfer, watching the balance grow, imagining the wedding I'd have, the dress I'd choose, the flowers, the venue by the lake that I'd toured 4 times before finally booking it. $32,000 of my money, earned through double shifts at the hospital during flu season, through skipping vacations and cooking at home instead of eating out, through saying no to brunches with friends because I was saving for something important. And my parents were supposed to match it, dollar for dollar, bringing the total to $64,000. Enough for the wedding I'd dreamed about since Michael proposed under the cherry blossoms at Millbrook Gardens, getting down on one knee with his grandmother's ring while the petals fell around us like snow. Michael pulled into our apartment complex parking lot and turned off the engine, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. "This is Vanessa's fourth business idea," I said, my voice coming out flat and strange. "The photography studio lasted 6 months, the online boutique 3 months, the lifestyle coaching maybe 2 weeks. Dad's given her money for all of them." Michael turned in his seat to face me, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the parking lot lamp. "How much has he given her before?" he asked quietly. I closed my eyes and did the math I'd been avoiding for years. Maybe 40,000 total, maybe more. I stopped keeping track because it made me feel bitter, and I didn't want to be bitter. I wanted to be understanding. She's trying to find herself. That's what Mom always says. Vanessa's trying to find her passion. The words tasted like acid. "And what about your passion?" Michael asked, and something in his tone made me look at him finally. His jaw was tight, his hands still gripping the steering wheel even though the car was off, and I realized he was angry in a way I'd rarely seen him angry. Not loud or explosive, but cold and focused. "I'm the reliable one," I said, and heard how pathetic it sounded. "I don't need finding. I don't need rescuing. I have a job and a degree and I pay my bills on time. So I don't get the attention or the money or the concern. I get to be stable while Vanessa gets to be supported." The pattern had been there my entire life, woven so tightly into the fabric of our family that I'd stopped seeing it as abnormal until Michael's anger in the car made me look at it clearly for the first time in years. When Vanessa graduated high school with a 2.8 GPA and got accepted to State University, my parents paid for everything: tuition, room and board, meal plan, a monthly allowance for expenses, even a new laptop and a car so she could come home on weekends. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table when I was 21, watching my father write a check for $18,000 for her first year, remembered how my mother had smiled and said, "We're so proud of you, Vanessa. College is a fresh start." I'd gotten accepted to the same university 3 years earlier with a 3.9 GPA and a partial academic scholarship, and my parents had sat me down and explained that they'd help where they could, but I needed to understand that college was an investment in my future and I should have skin in the game. Skin in the game meant I took out $45,000 in student loans that I'd been paying off for the past 6 years, loans that still had $19,000 left on them, loans that took $372 from my paycheck every single month. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree in healthcare administration, my parents came to the ceremony and took me to dinner at Olive Garden afterward, and my father gave me a card with a $50 bill inside and a note that said, "Proud of you, work hard." When Vanessa dropped out halfway through her junior year to find herself, they threw her a coming home party, and my mother spent weeks telling relatives that Vanessa was exploring her options and following her passion. When I was 16, I saved money from my job at the grocery store for 8 months to buy my first car, a 9-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door and 130,000 miles on it. And I'd been so proud of that car because I'd earned it myself. Vanessa got a brand new Volkswagen Jetta for her 16th birthday, silver with a sunroof, and she totaled it 4 months later texting while driving. My parents bought her another car, used but only 2 years old, and paid the insurance increase without a word of complaint. When I got my master's degree 2 years ago, juggling full-time work and night classes for 18 months, barely sleeping, living on coffee and determination, my parents didn't come to the graduation because it conflicted with Vanessa's birthday weekend in wine country. My mother called the night before and said, "You understand, honey. Vanessa really wanted this trip, and you're always so busy with work anyway. We'll celebrate when you have time." I'd celebrated alone with Michael and my best friend Rachel at a Thai restaurant near my apartment. And Rachel had gotten drunk on sake and said, "Emma, your family treats you like an afterthought, and it makes me want to scream." I'd laughed it off then, made excuses about how parents just worry more about the child who needs more help. But sitting in Michael's car with the rain falling and the weight of 64,000 stolen dollars pressing down on me, I finally heard the truth in what Rachel had been trying to tell me for years. Michael wasn't like my family, and maybe that was the first thing I'd loved about him, though I hadn't recognized it consciously until right now, sitting in our apartment while he made tea in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of the kettle and mugs, a small comfort against the enormity of what had just happened. We'd met 4 years ago at the annual Hospital Foundation fundraiser, one of those rubber chicken charity dinners where I'd been required to attend as part of the administrative team, and he'd been there because his software company had sponsored a table. I'd been standing by the silent auction table looking at a weekend getaway package I couldn't afford to bid on when he'd walked up and said, "The fishing trip is a better deal, better value for the minimum bid." And I'd laughed and said, "I don't fish." And he'd said, "Neither do I, but I'm good at math." We talked for 2 hours, long after our respective tables had stopped expecting us back, and I'd learned that he'd taught himself to code at 14, that he'd worked his way through community college and then state university, that his parents had died in a car accident when he was 23, and he'd used his small inheritance to start his company, rather than pay off his own student loans, because he believed in betting on himself. He'd built his business from nothing into a successful software consulting firm with 12 employees, and he'd done it without family money or connections, just work and talent, and the kind of stubborn determination I recognized because I saw it in my own mirror every morning. His parents had been gone for 5 years when we met, and sometimes I saw the grief flash across his face when someone mentioned their mother or father casually, the way people do when they assume everyone has parents to call on Sunday or visit for holidays. He'd told me once, maybe 6 months into our relationship, that the hardest part wasn't the big moments like graduations or promotions where you expected to miss them, but the small things, the way he'd wanted to call his dad the first time he signed a major client, or how he'd see a recipe his mom used to make and have nobody to ask for the exact measurements. When he proposed and we started planning the wedding, I'd noticed how much effort he put into getting to know my parents, how he'd asked my father about his work and complimented my mother's cooking and tried to build the kind of relationship with them that he'd lost with his own parents. I'd been touched by it, grateful that he was trying so hard, and I'd hidden the worst of my family's dynamics from him because I didn't want him to think less of them, didn't want him to know that the family he was working so hard to join didn't value their own daughter the way he valued me. He'd seen glimpses of it, the way my mother focused more attention on Vanessa at family dinners, the way my father's eyes glazed over when I talked about work. But I'd downplayed it, made excuses, protected them from his judgment because some part of me still hoped that if I just tried hard enough, sacrificed enough, they'd eventually see me the way Michael already did. But sitting in our living room watching him bring me tea in the blue mug he knew was my favorite, I realized his reaction tonight had been different than I expected. Not shocked or sympathetic, but calculating. Like he was already 10 steps ahead working through a problem that had a solution I couldn't see yet. I texted my father 3 days after the dinner and asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, because some part of me still believed that if I could talk to him calmly and rationally, without my mother's interference or Vanessa's presence, he'd understand what he'd done to me and find a way to make it right. We met at the Starbucks near his office on Thursday morning, and I got there early and ordered his usual venti dark roast and my own grande latte, and sat at a corner table rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd explain that $32,000 was 3 years of careful saving, of putting away money from every paycheck, of skipping vacations and living in my same small apartment when I could have upgraded and buying my clothes at outlet malls instead of regular stores. When he walked in, he looked tired, older somehow than he'd looked at dinner, and he sat down across from me and took a long drink of his coffee before saying, "Your mother thinks I should apologize. But I want you to understand that I made a practical decision based on who needed help more." I'd prepared a whole speech about betrayal and broken promises and the matching funds he'd committed to. But his preemptive statement knocked the words out of my head, and I just said, "Dad, that was my money. Money I saved. You gave away my money without asking me." He sighed like I was being difficult and said, "Vanessa needs it more, Emma. You're stable. You have a good job. You have Michael. You'll be fine. Vanessa is struggling to find her path, and this business could be the thing that finally works for her." I asked him what the business plan actually was, what Vanessa was planning to do with $32,000, and he got vague and said something about a boutique, a clothing store, maybe online. She was still working out the details, but the point was, she had passion and initiative and needed support. I felt something crack inside my chest when he said, "passion and initiative," about Vanessa, who'd never held a job longer than 7 months, who'd started a photography business that failed after 3 months, and a baking business that failed after 5, and a dog walking service that she abandoned when she realized it meant working early mornings. I asked him about the matching funds, the 64,000 total that was supposed to be for my wedding in 8 weeks, and he shifted in his chair and said, "Maybe you and Michael should consider postponing or having something simpler. Not everyone needs a big expensive wedding. Your mother and I got married at City Hall." I stared at him across the table and realized he was actually suggesting that I cancel or diminish my wedding because he'd stolen my money to give to my sister, and I asked him when he'd pay it back, when I could expect to have my savings returned, and he said, "Someday, when things are better financially. You know I'm planning to retire in a few years. We'll see how things go." Someday. No timeline, no commitment, no acknowledgement that he'd taken something that didn't belong to him. I left the coffee shop with my latte unfinished and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying not to cry, finally understanding that my father didn't see me as someone who deserved support or celebration, just as someone who'd be fine no matter what he took from me because I was always fine. Michael started taking phone calls in the other room 3 days after my coffee meeting with my father, and at first I thought nothing of it because he often took work calls in his home office. But then I noticed he was closing the door completely instead of leaving it half open the way he usually did, and his voice through the wall had a tone I couldn't quite identify, quieter than his normal business voice, more intense somehow. His desk, which was usually meticulously organized with his laptop, aligned exactly parallel to the edge, and his papers in neat stacks, sorted by project, started looking messy, scattered with documents he'd shuffle into drawers when I walked in, and twice I saw what looked like financial statements with numbers highlighted in yellow before he flipped them over casually and asked me about my day. I assumed he was worried about money, that he was going through our finances trying to figure out how we could afford the wedding, now that $64,000 had vanished, and the guilt settled over me like a weight I carried into every room. The knowledge that I'd brought my family's dysfunction into his life, into our relationship, into what should have been a happy time, planning our future together. He kept reassuring me that everything would be fine, that we'd figure it out, but I could see him thinking, always thinking, that look he got when he was working through a complex problem, breaking it down into component parts, and testing solutions in his head before committing to action. I started seriously considering suggesting we elope, just go to the courthouse like my father had so casually suggested. Give up on the idea of a real wedding with our friends and the few family members who actually cared about us, because what did it matter anyway when the people who should have been happiest for me had stolen from me instead? Rachel came over on Saturday with Thai food and wine and found me crying at the kitchen table looking at the venue contract with its non-refundable deposits due in 2 weeks, and she sat down across from me and said, "You need to stop protecting them. You need to tell people what they did to you. I'd drafted a text message to my parents the night before, something about needing space and establishing boundaries, about how their treatment of me was unacceptable and I wouldn't tolerate it anymore, but I hadn't sent it because even after everything, some part of me was still afraid of their reaction, still hoping they'd realize what they'd done and apologize and make it right. The wedding was 8 weeks away, and I'd started having nightmares about showing up to an empty venue because we couldn't pay for it, or walking down an aisle with my father beside me pretending nothing had happened while I died inside. My performance at work was slipping. I could feel it, the way I'd lose focus in meetings or have to read emails 3 times to understand them, and Dr. Chen had asked me twice if everything was okay, if I needed to take some personal time, but I'd smiled and said I was fine because I was always fine. That was what I did. I was fine while everything fell apart around me. My mother called on Tuesday afternoon while I was in a meeting with the hospital's finance committee, and I saw her name flash on my phone 3 times before I finally excused myself and called her back from the hallway, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Emma, you need to stop being so dramatic about this. Vanessa is your sister. Family helps family." I stood there in the empty corridor with my phone pressed against my ear, feeling something hot and sharp rise in my throat, and I asked her if she understood that Dad had given away my money I'd saved for 3 years, and she sighed in that way she'd been sighing at me my entire life and said, "It's not about the money, it's about supporting each other. Your father made a decision he thought was best for everyone. You'll have other opportunities for weddings or parties or whatever you want." Other opportunities. Like my wedding was some casual event I could reschedule like a dentist appointment. I went back to my meeting and couldn't focus on a single word about supply chain costs and equipment budgets. That evening, I was scrolling through Instagram and saw that Vanessa had posted a photo of herself in front of a blank storefront with a for lease sign, captioned, "Starting my dream with the support of my amazing family. So grateful for parents who believe in me. Hashtag new beginnings. Entrepreneur. Family first." The post had 63 likes and comments from cousins and family friends I'd grown up with. People saying, "Congratulations," and "So exciting," and "Your parents must be so proud." And not one of them knew that her dream was funded by theft, that the support she was grateful for had been ripped away from me. I called Vanessa directly, something I hadn't planned to do, something I did in a white-hot moment of rage I couldn't contain anymore. And when she answered with a cheerful, "Hey, what's up?" I asked her if she had any idea what she'd done, if she felt even slightly bad about taking my wedding money, and there was a pause before she said, "Dad offered it to me, Emma. He said he wanted to help me get started. It's not my fault you're jealous that he's supporting my business." Jealous. The word hit me like a slap. I asked her if she'd even asked where the money came from, if she'd wondered why Dad suddenly had $32,000 to give her, and she said, "I didn't ask questions. Maybe you should be happy for me instead of making everything about you like you always do." I hung up on her, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped my phone. She felt no remorse, no guilt, just entitlement, pure and complete, the same entitlement she'd been raised with while I'd been taught to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention or support came my way. I told Michael that night that I wanted to uninvite my parents from the wedding, that I couldn't stand at an altar and pretend everything was fine while they sat in the audience having faced no consequences for what they'd done to me, and Michael looked at me with that expression he'd been wearing for days, that calm, purposeful look, and said, "Wait, trust me, I have a plan." Something in his voice made me stop, made me actually look at him instead of just drowning in my own pain, and I saw a confidence there that didn't match our circumstances, a certainty that seemed impossible given that we were supposed to be financially devastated. He asked me if I'd be willing to host an engagement party in 6 weeks, 2 weeks before the wedding, and invite everyone, both families and our friends and some colleagues, and I stared at him like he'd lost his mind, because why would we spend money we didn't have on a party? And he said, "Trust me, this is important. I need you to do this." I agreed because I'd always trusted Michael, because in 4 years together he'd never steered me wrong, but I couldn't understand what he was planning or why his mysterious confidence made me feel something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Michael made the reservation at Luminaire, which was an upscale event space downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a private dining room that could hold 80 people. And when he showed me the confirmation email with the deposit receipt, I stared at the number and felt my stomach drop, because we were supposed to be conserving money, trying to figure out how to afford a wedding with $64,000 missing. And here he was spending $3,000 on an engagement party 6 weeks before the actual wedding. "Michael, we can't afford this," I said, sitting at our kitchen table with the laptop between us, showing photos of the elegant space with its crystal chandeliers and white marble floors. And he closed the laptop gently and took both my hands in his and said, "Trust me. This is important. I need you to do this." There was something in his voice that stopped my protests, a certainty that didn't match our circumstances, and I found myself nodding, even though nothing made sense. He insisted on handling all the planning himself, which was unusual because we'd been making wedding decisions together for months. But suddenly, he was coordinating with the venue and the caterer and creating the guest list mostly on his own, asking me only to confirm names and addresses. The list included both our families, which made my anxiety spike because I couldn't imagine sitting in a room celebrating with my parents after what they'd done. But it also included our close friends, some of my colleagues from the hospital, and oddly, some people I didn't expect, like Michael's best man Derek, and a few of his work friends I'd only met once or twice. "Why are we inviting so many people?" I asked him one evening while he was typing on his laptop, and he glanced up with that calm, purposeful expression he'd been wearing for weeks and said, "Because I want everyone who matters to be there." His demeanor had shifted completely from those first few days after my father's theft, when he'd been quietly angry and protective. Now he seemed almost anticipatory, like someone counting down to something important, checking items off an invisible list in his head. I was anxious about the party, dreading having to face my parents and Vanessa and pretend everything was fine, dreading the questions from relatives who might wonder why I seemed tense, and I told Michael more than once that I didn't want to do this, that we should cancel, but he convinced me each time that it was necessary, that he needed me to trust him just a little longer. The week before the party, his mysterious behavior intensified. I came home from work on Tuesday to find him in his office on a video call with someone, and through the half-open door I heard him say, "Yes, she'll be completely surprised. She has no idea." When I walked past, he smiled at me and mouthed, "Work call," but I'd seen his screen for just a second, and it definitely wasn't his usual work interface. On Thursday, I was having lunch in the hospital cafeteria when I saw Michael's name in an email chain with Dr. Patricia Chen, my boss, which made absolutely no sense because they'd never had reason to communicate before. And when I scrolled through the messages, they were heavily redacted with most of the content hidden from me, just brief confirmations of times and dates. I asked Rachel about it that night when she came over with wedding magazines we were supposed to be looking through, and she got a strange look on her face, almost guilty, and said, "I can't tell you, but Emma, you need to trust him. Just trust him and go to this party." The fact that Rachel knew something I didn't made the knot in my stomach tighten, but it also made that fragile hope stronger, because Rachel wouldn't be calm if Michael was planning something that would hurt me. The night of the engagement party arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October, and I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in our apartment trying to fix my makeup for the third time because my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and Michael came up behind me and put his hands on my shoulders and said, "You look beautiful. Everything is going to be okay." And I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I didn't understand. We arrived at Luminaire at 6:30, half an hour before guests were scheduled to arrive, and the private dining room took my breath away with its floor-to-ceiling windows, showing the city lights beginning to sparkle in the dusk, and the long tables set with white linens and crystal glasses, and centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. Michael walked through the room checking things with the event coordinator, and I noticed there was a microphone stand at the head of the room and a large screen mounted on the wall. And when I asked him about it, he said, "For toasts. I thought we'd do some speeches," which seemed excessive for an engagement party, but I was too nervous to question it. The guests started arriving at 7, and I stood near the entrance with Michael greeting people, and Rachel came first and hugged me tightly and whispered, "Trust him, just trust him," which did nothing to calm my racing heart. My parents arrived at 7:15, and my mother kissed my cheek like nothing had happened, and my father shook Michael's hand and said, "Nice venue you picked," and I felt Michael's hand tighten slightly on my back. Then Vanessa walked in behind them, which sent a jolt of anger through me because I hadn't invited her, and she was carrying a new designer handbag that probably cost $800 and wearing an outfit that looked like it came from the boutique she was supposedly opening, and she smiled at me and said, "Congratulations on the party. Mom said I should come." And I couldn't speak, could only nod and watch her walk into the room like she belonged there. More guests arrived, colleagues from the hospital, including Dr. Chen, who gave me a warm hug and said, "Wouldn't miss this for anything," which struck me as odd, because while we worked together well, she'd never attended a social event of mine before. Michael's best man, Derek, arrived with his wife, and I saw him exchange a look with Michael, something knowing passing between them. Then I noticed Professor Raymond from the university where I'd gotten my master's degree 6 years ago, someone I hadn't seen since graduation. And I started to ask Michael why he'd invited him, but Michael was already moving toward the center of the room, checking his watch, and the expression on his face was calm and purposeful, and almost anticipatory, like someone who'd planned something down to the minute and was watching it unfold exactly as intended. Dinner was served at 7:45, and I sat at the head table next to Michael, barely tasting the food, watching him make conversation with the guests at our table while that knot in my stomach grew tighter, and at 8:30 he checked his watch again and then reached over and squeezed my hand and stood up. Michael walked to the microphone with a glass of champagne in his hand, and the room gradually quieted as people noticed him standing there, and he tapped the microphone twice and said, "If I could have everyone's attention, I'd like to make a toast." And the remaining conversations died down until there was complete silence, except for the soft background music that the coordinator quickly faded out. I sat frozen in my chair, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, watching him stand there with that calm, purposeful expression I'd been seeing for weeks. And he began by saying, "4 years ago, I met Emma at a hospital fundraiser. I was there because my company was sponsoring the event, and she was there because she'd organized the entire thing while also working 50-hour weeks in hospital administration." He smiled at me, and there were some warm chuckles from the guests who knew me. I watched her that night, making sure every detail was perfect, thanking every volunteer, remembering every donor's name, and I thought, that's the most capable person I've ever seen. So I asked her to dinner, and she said yes, and I fell in love with her work ethic first, then her kindness, then her intelligence, then everything else. The room made appreciative sounds, and I felt my face flush, and my mother was smiling at me from across the room, and I thought maybe this was just going to be a normal toast after all. Just Michael being sweet, but then his expression shifted slightly, became more serious, and he said, "Emma never told me everything about herself, though. She's humble like that. She never told me, for instance, that she paid $45,000 in student loans entirely by herself, while her sister's college was paid for by their parents." The appreciative murmurs stopped abruptly, and I felt the air in the room change, become charged with tension, and my father shifted in his seat, and Michael continued. "She never told me that she saved $32,000 for our wedding over 3 years, putting away money from every paycheck, sacrificing vacations and new clothes and dinners out, because she wanted to contribute equally to building our life together." The room was completely silent now, everyone's attention locked on Michael, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and he said, "And she definitely never told me that her father gave that money away to her sister 2 weeks ago without asking her permission." The gasps were audible, a wave of shock moving through the room, and people turned to look at my parents, and my father's face went red, and he started to stand, and he said, "Now hold on, this is private family business. You have no right." And Michael's voice cut through the room, firm and clear and absolutely unyielding. "Sit down. I'm not finished." My father froze, half standing, and Derek stood up from his seat at the side of the room, 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, and my father slowly sank back into his chair. And I was mortified and shocked, and also suddenly, strangely curious about what Michael was going to say next, because his tone wasn't angry, wasn't emotional, was just completely factual, and somehow that made it more powerful, like he was simply presenting evidence that spoke for itself. Michael stood there for a moment, letting the tension build, and then he said, in that same calm, clear voice, "I couldn't replace that money, but I could do something else." And behind him, the screen suddenly lit up with a projection that made everyone turn to look, and I saw an official letterhead from the Regional Hospital Foundation at the top of the document displayed there, and Michael said, "Emma doesn't know this, but 2 weeks ago, I started contacting people who actually value her." And Dr. Chen stood up from her seat at one of the side tables. And she smiled at me with warmth I'd never seen from her in our professional relationship. And she said, "Emma, it's my honor to inform you that you've been nominated for the Regional Healthcare Administrator of the Year award. The selection committee reviewed your work on the Patient Services Redesign Initiative, your leadership during the staffing crisis last year, and your consistent advocacy for both staff and patients, and you've been selected as this year's recipient." The room erupted in applause, and I felt tears start streaming down my face, because I'd had no idea, had never even known such an award existed. And Dr. Chen continued, "The award comes with a $15,000 professional development grant for continuing education or research in healthcare administration." And the applause grew louder. And I looked at Michael standing at the microphone with tears blurring my vision, and he was smiling at me with such love and pride that I felt something crack open in my chest. The screen changed to a second slide, and I saw the university logo from where I'd gotten my master's degree, and Professor Raymond stood up, and Michael said, "Emma mentioned once, exactly once in 4 years, that she'd thought about getting a PhD but couldn't afford it and didn't have time. So I contacted her former professors." And Professor Raymond said, "Emma, your master's thesis on healthcare accessibility in rural communities was one of the best I've supervised in 20 years of teaching. I've been working with colleagues in our doctoral program, and we'd like to offer you a full scholarship for our PhD program in health policy and administration, including a stipend for research. We've already processed your acceptance based on your previous academic record." And he held up an official acceptance letter, and the room exploded again with applause and cheers, and I couldn't stop crying, couldn't process what was happening. And I saw my mother's face frozen in shock, and my father staring at the table, and Vanessa looking around wildly like she wanted to disappear. Then the screen changed a third time, and Michael said, "And finally, my contribution." And there was an image of his vintage car collection, the 3 classic cars he'd inherited from his father and spent years restoring. Cars he took to shows on weekends and polished in our garage and talked about with the kind of reverence most people reserve for family heirlooms. And he said, "I sold them 2 weeks ago for $85,000. And the room went completely silent with shock. And he looked directly at me and said, "More than enough for the wedding Emma deserves, and for a down payment on a house, and for whatever else we need to build our life together without anyone's help or approval." The room erupted in applause, people standing from their tables, and the sound was thunderous in the enclosed space. And I sat there crying so hard I could barely see, my hands covering my face, and I felt Rachel's arm around my shoulders and heard her saying, "You deserve this. You deserve all of this." And when I finally looked up through my tears, I saw my parents sitting in complete mortified silence, my father staring at his plate with his jaw clenched, and my mother's face pale and shocked. and Vanessa looked around the room with wide eyes like a trapped animal looking for escape. Michael waited for the applause to die down, and then he continued in that same calm, unwavering voice. Emma has spent her entire life proving her worth to people who refuse to see it. And he gestured toward my parents without looking at them, and he said, she graduated top of her class in high school, paid her own way through college and graduate school, built a career helping people, saved money with discipline most people can't imagine. And through it all, she kept hoping that maybe this time, maybe this achievement, maybe this sacrifice would finally be enough. And his voice grew stronger, more passionate, and he said, I see it. Dr. Chen sees it. Professor Raymond sees it. Everyone in this room sees it. And he swept his arm to indicate all the guests watching with rapt attention, and he said, and after tonight, everyone here sees exactly what her family did to her. Vanessa stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and she grabbed her purse and started toward the exit, and Michael's voice cut across the room. Stay. You wanted family support, right? That's what you posted on social media. So stay and watch Emma get real support. Vanessa froze, and Derek was standing near the exit, and she slowly turned around and sat back down, her face red with humiliation. Rachel stood up from beside me, and she said in a voice that shook with emotion, I've known Emma for 12 years. I've watched her parents dismiss every achievement. Watched them give her sister everything while Emma fought for scraps. Watched Emma try so hard to be good enough that it broke my heart. And she looked directly at my father and said, You should be ashamed of yourself. And other people began standing, colleagues from the hospital, friends from my graduate program, people I'd helped over the years, all of them approaching me with hugs and congratulations and expressions of support that made me feel simultaneously overwhelmed and validated in a way I'd never experienced. My father suddenly stood up, his face flushed, and he said loudly, We were trying to help Vanessa start a business, trying to give her a chance at success. And his voice had that defensive edge I'd heard my whole life when he was justifying treating her better than me. And Michael turned to face him directly and said in a voice that carried absolute authority, With stolen money, Emma never gave you permission to give away her savings. The legal term is conversion of funds, and in this state it's both a civil and criminal matter. And my father's face went from red to white, and Michael continued, I spoke with an attorney before tonight. Emma would be well within her rights to pursue charges. And the room went completely silent, and I found my voice rising in my throat, found myself standing up on shaking legs, found words I'd been holding back for 28 years finally ready to come out. I stood up on legs that felt stronger than they had in years, and the room went quiet as people turned to watch me. And I wiped the tears from my face and took a breath that felt like the first real breath I'd taken in 28 years, and I looked directly at my father and said, I've spent my entire life trying to earn your pride. Every achievement, every sacrifice, every time I did the right thing while Vanessa did whatever she wanted, I told myself that eventually you'd see me the way you see her. And my voice was shaking, but it was strong, and I continued. I graduated as valedictorian, and you missed my speech because Vanessa had a dance recital. I got into my top choice college, and you told me to pick somewhere cheaper because we couldn't afford it. And then 2 years later, you paid for Vanessa's entire education at a private school that cost twice as much. And I saw my father's jaw clench and my mother starting to cry. And I said, I worked full-time through graduate school, took out $45,000 in loans that I'm still paying off, earned my master's degree while working night shifts, and you came to my graduation for an hour before leaving early for Vanessa's birthday dinner. And the words were pouring out of me now, all the hurt and disappointment and hope I'd carried for so long. And I turned to look at Vanessa and said, I thought if I just achieved enough, sacrificed enough, was good enough, that maybe you'd value me the way you value her. And I pointed at my sister who was staring at the table, her face red, and I said, But Michael showed me something tonight. He showed me that I don't need your validation. I never did. I looked around the room at all the people who had stood up for me, who had celebrated my achievements, who had seen my worth without me having to beg for their recognition, and I said, I have a career where I make a real difference in people's lives. I have a master's degree that I earned myself. I saved $32,000 through discipline and sacrifice and planning, and the fact that you gave it away like it meant nothing tells me everything I need to know about how you see me. And I turned back to my father and said, the money doesn't even matter anymore, Dad. What matters is that I'm done. I'm done being the reliable daughter who gets nothing in return. I'm done putting your feelings ahead of my own. I'm done hoping that this time, finally, I'll be enough for you. I looked at my mother, who was crying openly now, and I said, you watched this happen my whole life. Every time he chose her over me, every time he dismissed my achievements, every time he gave her what he refused to give me, you stood there and said nothing. And my mother reached out toward me, but I stepped back and said, you let him treat me like I didn't matter, and your silence hurt just as much as his favoritism. And then I turned to Vanessa and said in a voice that was sad rather than angry, I hope that money serves you better than our relationship did. And finally, I looked at both of my parents and said clearly, loudly, so everyone in the room could hear, you're not invited to my wedding. I don't want you there. I'm going to marry Michael surrounded by people who actually love me, who see my worth, who celebrate my happiness instead of taking from me. And the power shift was complete and absolute, and I was finally in control of my own life. My parents stood up immediately after I uninvited them from the wedding, my father's face dark with anger and humiliation, and my mother still crying, and they didn't say a word as they gathered their coats and walked toward the exit, and Vanessa scrambled to follow them, clutching her designer purse and avoiding everyone's eyes, and the three of them left the private room in complete silence while 60 people watched them go. The door closed behind them, and for a moment, nobody moved. And then my Aunt Martha stood up from a table near the back, my father's older sister, whom I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. And she walked over to me with tears in her eyes and pulled me into a tight hug and said, Emma, I had absolutely no idea he was treating you this way. If I had known, if any of us had known, we would have said something years ago. And she pulled back to look at me and said, your father was the baby of our family, and we spoiled him, and I'm sorry to see he did the same thing with Vanessa. And other extended family members began approaching, cousins and uncles and family friends, and several of them expressed shock at what they'd just learned, saying they'd always assumed I was the favored daughter because I was so successful, and one of my cousins said, we all thought you were doing so well that your parents focused on Vanessa because she needed more help. We never knew they were taking from you to give to her. And the support that coalesced around me in those moments felt like a physical warmth spreading through my chest. Michael stayed close beside me, his hand on the small of my back. And when there was finally a brief pause and people approaching us, I turned to him and pulled him aside to a quieter corner of the room. And I looked up at him with tears still streaming down my face and said, you sold your father's cars, Michael. Those cars were all you had left of him. And my voice broke on the words, because I knew how much that collection had meant to him, how he'd spent weekends carefully maintaining them, how he'd told me stories about learning to change oil and replace brake pads while working alongside his dad in their garage. Michael cupped my face in his hands and wiped my tears with his thumbs and said, you would have never put yourself first. Someone had to. And his voice was gentle but firm, and he said, my dad died when I was 19, and those cars were important to me because they reminded me of him. But you know what he told me the last time we worked on the '67 Mustang together? And I shook my head, and he said, he told me that things are just things, that the only wealth that matters is the people you love and the life you build with them. And he smiled and said, Emma, my dad would have loved you. He would have seen exactly what I see, and he would have told me I was the luckiest man alive, and he would have absolutely approved of me selling those cars to give you the wedding and the recognition you deserve. I threw my arms around his neck and held him tight, and I felt the bond between us deepen in that moment into something even stronger than it had been before. Felt the absolute certainty that I was marrying the right person, someone who saw my worth and celebrated it, and fought for me in ways my own family never had. Rachel appeared beside us and said, "Okay, we are not letting those people ruin this night." And she raised her voice and said, "Everyone, the celebration continues because Emma deserves to be celebrated." And people cheered, and the mood shifted from shocked sympathy to genuine joy. And Dr. Chen approached with a glass of champagne and said, "Emma, I want you to know that nominating you for that award was the easiest decision I've made all year. You're the backbone of our administrative team, and the hospital is better because you're there." And Professor Raymond from my graduate program joined us and began discussing the PhD program, the research opportunities available, the chance to contribute to healthcare policy literature, and I realized that while my parents were driving home in shame and anger, I was standing in a room surrounded by people who genuinely valued me, who saw my achievements and my potential and my worth without me having to beg for their recognition. The night continued for another 2 hours, and it transformed from an engagement party into something more like a celebration of everything I'd accomplished, despite the obstacles my family had put in my way. And when Michael and I finally left the venue near midnight, I felt exhausted, but lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying since childhood. And I knew that uninviting my parents from the wedding was exactly the right decision, that I was finally choosing myself and the people who actually loved me. 2 weeks later, I stood in the bridal suite of the garden venue Michael and I had chosen, looking at myself in the full-length mirror, wearing the dress I'd selected without having to compromise on budget or apologize for the cost. And the woman looking back at me seemed different from the one who'd sat at her parents' dinner table 6 weeks earlier, listening to her father casually announce he'd given away her wedding fund. Rachel was adjusting my veil and crying happy tears, and through the window I could see the 40 guests Michael and I had invited taking their seats in the garden where white chairs were arranged in neat rows facing an arch covered in roses and hydrangeas, and my parents were not among them, and I felt no guilt about that absence, only relief. My Uncle James, my father's older brother, who had called me 2 days after the engagement party to say he was ashamed of his younger brother's behavior, knocked on the door and entered looking dignified in his dark suit, and he'd agreed immediately when I asked him to walk me down the aisle, saying it would be his honor to stand in for someone who didn't deserve the privilege. The ceremony was everything I'd wanted, intimate and meaningful, and filled with people who genuinely loved us. And when I walked down the aisle on Uncle James's arm, I saw Michael waiting for me with tears in his eyes, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly right, that this was how it was supposed to feel, and our vows were personal and emotional, and when he promised to always see my worth and choose me first, I believed him completely because he'd already proven it in the most spectacular way possible. The reception continued the joy, without any undercurrent of family tension or obligation. No worrying about whether my parents approved of the music or the food or whether Vanessa was getting enough attention, and I danced with Michael and laughed with Rachel and accepted congratulations from colleagues and friends who'd become my chosen family. During dinner, Rachel leaned over and whispered that she'd heard through the family grapevine that Vanessa's boutique was already failing, that she'd spent most of the money on inventory she couldn't sell and a lease she couldn't afford, and that my parents had reached out to Aunt Martha asking if she thought I'd be open to reconciliation, and I'd told my aunt when she called me, maybe someday, but not today, because I'd learned that boundaries weren't cruel, they were necessary, and that I didn't owe my parents forgiveness just because they'd finally realized the consequences of their choices. I'd accepted the PhD program on a part-time basis so I could continue working, and I was using the $15,000 professional development grant to fund my research into healthcare accessibility, and Michael had replaced his vintage car collection with a practical sedan and told me repeatedly that he had no regrets, that watching me thrive was worth more than any possession. That night in our hotel room after the wedding, still in my dress with my makeup smeared from happy tears, I turned to Michael and said, "You changed everything." And he pulled me close and said, "I just showed everyone what I already knew, that you're extraordinary." And I realized that for the first time in my life, I actually believed that about myself. Not because I'd earned it through years of sacrifice and achievement and trying to prove my worth, but because I'd finally understood that I was inherently valuable just as I was, that I deserved good things and love and celebration not as rewards for being good enough, but simply because I existed and I mattered. 3 months later, I'd be standing in our living room, looking at our wedding photo on the mantel, surrounded by my framed master's degree and my healthcare administrator of the year certificate and my PhD program acceptance letter, and I'd think about how the family you're born into sometimes can't or won't see your worth, but the family you choose, your partner, your friends, the people who celebrate your successes and stand up for you when you can't stand up for yourself, can love you better and more truly than you ever imagined possible. I finally understood that the family you choose can love you better than the family you're born into, and looking at Michael sleeping peacefully beside me on our wedding night, thinking about Rachel and Aunt Martha and Dr. Chen and all the people who'd stood in that room and witnessed my worth, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd chosen right.